Alright, so only one day later than I had actually planned. Hooray! I'm getting back to Transformers Prime reviews this week as well. Yes, as that implies, for those of you who haven't clicked that little bell icon next to the subscription button yet, and therefore are only notified of about 20% of the videos that I actually make, because YouTube's a dumpster fire, I have gotten back to reviewing Teen Titans and now Transformers Prime, starting this week after the complete burnout that I suffered thanks to the Star vs. Nuke, which I will never forgive Disney for, until I get around to playing Kingdom Hearts 3, at which point I'll probably forgive them immediately. And that does mean that finally I'm getting around to reviewing the second half of Operation Bumblebee, the fourth and fifth episodes of the second season of Transformers Prime. And right out the gate, I will lament that after a fantastic setup of an episode, which was the first half of this two-parter, part 2 of Operation Bumblebee lets me down a bit. Like, not a lot. It's still not an awful episode. But it lets me down enough that I felt it necessary to front-load the review with that information. As for what happens in the episode, Bumblebee goes off that cliff, as we saw at the end of part 1, and instead of turn around and finish him off, Knockout just leaves, I guess, and then Breakdown just leaves, I guess. Maybe he was beaten by Bulkhead and I just don't remember. It's been a while since I actually watched part 1. But it does seem strange that there were 2 Decepticons there, and neither one of them thought to check whether or not this was an opportune time to actually kill Bumblebee off once and for all, because he's immediately back at Autobot base being checked up on by Ratchet. And we get a really great Optimus Prime scene here. The others are sort of reprimanding Bumblebee for his reckless behavior, and Optimus steps in, saying that doing so isn't going to amount to anything, but he does put his foot down and say that Bumblebee needs to stay at base until he can transform again, because he's just a liability to himself and everyone he cares about right now, especially with how impulsive he's being lately. And this is when, if you remember, Ratchet's plot from part 1 starts to pay off. If you recall, Ratchet, back when he was just a regular field medic, was the one who treated Bumblebee's damaged voice box after a stint being tortured by the Decepticons. And it was his failure to effect the best possible repairs that he could to that piece of biotechnology, which can't just be replaced, that has left Bumblebee speaking R2-D2Es. So when he goes to Optimus and offers to give Bumblebee his TCOG, Optimus thinks that Ratchet is just being emotional because he still blames himself for Bumblebee's voice box, which is true, but that doesn't negate the fact that he has really logical reasons for making this offer. Like, apparently TCOGs are plug and play. It doesn't matter where one comes from, it works in any Transformer. So this is definitely doable. And frankly put, Ratchet, when he says that he doesn't need his vehicle mode nearly as much as Bumblebee does, he's right, 100%. He spends most of his time in the base doing technical stuff with his robot hands, and when he does go off-site, he tends to ground bridge to exactly where he needs to be, and then ground bridge back when he's done doing the exact thing that he needed to be done. He's not a scout. He's not scouting places out. He's going to the scouted out places and doing very specific technical things. We've even seen him fight, and unlike RC or Bumblebee, his fighting style doesn't involve his vehicle mode at all. So yeah, he wouldn't be able to call on his weapons. He might have to take some off-board weapons with him or something if he does have to go into battle. But if he did have to go into battle without the ability to transform, he would not be at nearly the disadvantage that Bumblebee is. And like, Ratchet doesn't get into all of that, but it's clear that he understands all of that. And when Optimus's only logical retort is that he's sure that they'll get Bumblebee's original TCOG back, I just kind of rolled my eyes. Because if they get Bumblebee's original TCOG back, they can just give it to Ratchet instead. In the end, though, logic does win out. In a show where, as good as it is, that's not always true. So I applaud this episode for that at least. And they do decide to go through with the procedure, putting RC in charge of actually performing it, since she has the smallest, most delicate, most precise hands out of the entire group. Aside, I guess, from Ratchet. But he can't do it, because he'd be operating on himself, and that's not something that robots can do, I guess, which sets back some of my own plans. And in order to perform the procedure, they start by putting Ratchet into induced stasis, which, for those who aren't aware, stasis for a Transformer isn't just going unconscious, it's more like a medically induced coma. And it's because of this that Ratchet doesn't hear when another relic signal is detected by the Autobots, and Optimus calls RC away to join him and Bulkhead in a retrieval mission. And it's because of this that Ratchet hasn't regained his senses yet when Agent Fowler calls in with the coordinates to Mech's base. Bumblebee and the kids are the only people there who are capable of hearing and processing this information. And even though Optimus told Bumblebee to stay at base until he could transform again, and even though they weren't able to complete the procedure to restore his ability to transform, he goes anyway. And it's Jack who makes the call. And that's one of the things that annoys me about this episode the most. They're clearly building up Jack as an up-and-coming leader, and I genuinely think that this was a stupid choice to make. Mech's experiments take time. It's not as if the Autobots needed to get to Mech as soon as possible. Mech certainly isn't as immediate a threat right now as Decepticon weapons, and as we learn at about this point in the episode as well, relics of the Primes, like literal relics of the original 13 Primes, who were basically like gods to other Transformers. And yet Jack makes that judgment call and convinces Fowler to relay the coordinates, which is what allows Bumblebee to go and take on Mech. And Starscream, who is still working with Mech himself without any weapons of any kind at all, except his fists and his feet. Meanwhile, Breakdown and Knockout being armed with the Decepticon weapon that he recovered at the end of the previous episode, which is a shield generator, which also allows him to project his shield at other people, making it an offensive and defensive weapon, have unearthed the Forge of Solus Prime, a really heavy warhammer which, when wielded by a Prime, can turn raw materials into mechanisms. With this, theoretically, the Autobots could upgrade themselves endlessly or create any weapon they envision. Or create a new T-Cog for Bumblebee out of nothing. Effectively, they would need the raw materials. But that would be it. And based on something that we see Megatron trying later when he's confirming whether or not he can use the Forge himself, he can't. It doesn't even seem like the raw materials have to actually be what the thing would be made from itself. It looks like they can just be anything of equivalent mass. This is basically frickin' alchemy we're talking about here. But even more powerful, because I guess you could straight up turn regular Earth metals into Transformer metals. That's insane. And unfortunately, with an assist from Megatron, Knockout and Breakdown do get away with the Forge. Again, the Decepticons can't use it except to hit things or people, I guess. But that means that the Autobots don't have it either. Meanwhile, back with Mech, Bumblebee is hit by Starscream's, I guess it's supposed to be a null ray since it shuts Bumblebee down for a few seconds. Even though I do remember at one point Starscream said something about not wanting to install null rays in himself. Whatever. Silas decides that since obviously the location of their base is compromised, he's just gonna gather up all his men and run away, leaving Starscream behind with the T-Cog in his hand and entrusting him with destroying Bumblebee before he goes, I guess? Which is just so stupid. Everything about this scene is so stupid. Like, I've complained before about the Autobots letting their mortal enemies live when they're at war with them. And it would be a net positive for all life everywhere to kill the Decepticons when they have the chance to do so. But at the very least, I can understand why the heroes don't kill people who are lying unconscious on the ground. That would, at least to most people, cause them to stop feeling like heroes. But mech are villains. Like, I know right now they're super hyper-fixating on this TCOG thing because they really want to get their own Transformer functioning. And I know that they know they wouldn't get a second TCOG from Bumblebee or anything because they literally already took his. But he has other parts that they would want. Most especially, like, the weapons in his arms. You know, those arms which are only connected to his body by relatively flimsy joints that mech's technicians with their intimate knowledge of how Transformers work should be able to pop off in seconds. I simply cannot believe that mech would not have cannibalized Bumblebee for parts before leaving. And I know some of y'all are going to say that they didn't do that because they were worried about somebody else showing up at the base and catching them in the act and screwing up their plans even worse than they've already been screwed up. But clearly that isn't the case, because when they run out of the base and leave Starscream behind, they stop at a ridge overlooking the base. It's like not that far away. And then they wait there, and then when Starscream shows up without the TCOG, having blasted it and now thinking that it's completely non-functional, they actually take the time to stun him and strip him of his TCOG like they did Bumblebee last episode. Clearly they were not worried about whether or not they had enough time to get anything else done. And then what's even more egregious is Bumblebee then walks out of the base to meet the Autobots when they show up to rescue him, holding his destroyed TCOG, but otherwise completely unharmed. Apparently, Starscream couldn't just shoot him a couple more times before he left, despite the fact that that is absolutely something that Starscream would do. He bragged in this very episode during an Energon retrieval mission with mech that he killed Cliffjumper. They brought it up in this episode that he not only kills Autobots when he has the chance, but that he's proud of it, and yet he doesn't kill Bumblebee when he has the chance. He just destroys Bumblebee's TCOG and then leaves. Like, I really like Ratchet's journey in this and the previous episode, despite the fact that it's not even enough to constitute a B-plot. But the sheer idiocy of this conclusion, and then the fact that at the end we see that Bumblebee didn't learn anything to begin with, really sours my perception of the episode, because it turns out Ratchet is able to repair the blasted TCOG, Bumblebee's original TCOG, enough to get it functioning again and give it back to Bumblebee. He's able to transform again. And this is great. It restores Ratchet's confidence. He's able to see a very tangible example of how much he's improved as a medic, which helps him to move past blaming himself for failing Bumblebee in the past. But during the very same scene when we see the tail end of this surgery, which did not involve putting Bumblebee into stasis, apparently, even though that was apparently necessary for this earlier on in the episode. Whatever. Ratchet insists to Bumblebee that this soon after a major procedure, he should wait to do anything really strenuous, and yet Bumblebee immediately transforms and drives off recklessly, giving the kids a ride. Like, he screwed the pooch so many times during this two-parter because of how impulsive he is, running off half-cocked without really thinking, and getting himself into trouble. And here he is, being impulsive, running off half-cocked and risking real trouble to his health and wellness. He didn't learn a thing. Like, the only change they would have had to make to this scene to bring the episode back around for me here at the end is to have Bumblebee, like, transform his arm weapons out first just to show that he could transform, and then he gets all excited and goes to start to transform into vehicle mode, but Ratchet says that he shouldn't, he should wait. And so he doesn't, and he waits, acknowledging that he learned something from these events and is going to think things through better and take things a little more slowly whenever he actually can. Like, I get happy ending. We want to see Bumblebee ride off into the sunset, or drive off out of the base in this case, I guess, to show that everything's okay, that we have regressed to the closest to the status quo that we could get back to at the end of this episode, in which Starscream did lose his ability to transform, at least for a while. But if you're averse to changing up the status quo too much in an episode of your show, then don't start writing a story in which the logical conclusion of that story would be for the status quo to change in a major way. This is a story which should have led to multiple shakeups of the status quo. And that's not even mentioning the fact that, technically speaking, by Ratchet being able to fix the T-Cog as much as he did, and Bumblebee never showing any side effects from the fact that it still does have some damage to it, it almost feels like here at the end, Bumblebee was rewarded for his reckless behavior. Not just that he didn't learn anything, he was straight up rewarded for it. I don't know, it's just, I can think of like at least half a dozen ways, slightly different ways, that this episode could have gone, which would have paid off the setup of part one so much better, without really affecting things down the line, that it makes me question why this episode ended up in the form that it was, why the conclusion felt so lazy and poorly thought through, and why Bumblebee didn't develop at all across 2 episodes titled Operation Bumblebee. I still think this is a good episode. I think it's a good episode for Ratchet's character. I think it has some fantastic moments and action set pieces in it. And the Forge of Solus Prime is in play now, which is fantastic. But after the great setup, which part 1 consisted almost entirely of, this episode was a disappointment. All of that said, though, guys, what did you think of Operation Bumblebee Part 2? If you have seen it, let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below, or over in my Discord, link in the description. And again, a reminder that I did review an episode of Teen Titans this week as well. Just in case you haven't seen it, you should probably go check that out. I think it's one of my better recent videos. Either way, though, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.